Hello and welcome to a special Politics at Sam and Anne's debrief edition, straight after Rachel Reeves sat down after delivering the spring forecast.
We now come to the spring forecast. I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
My name's Sam Coates of Sky News, and I'm bringing you this podcast from the heart of the Resolution Foundation, the economic powerhouse think tank just off Parliament Square. That's where I've been watching the speech and also watching the team here, led by Ruth Curtis, who we'll hear from in a moment, pour through the report by the Office of Budget Responsibility.
My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico. A confident Rachel Reeves in the chamber, speaking for just over 20 minutes, a moment to boast about those green shoots. But is the reality overtaking her optimism?
This government has the right economic plan for our country. A plan that is even more important in a world that in the last few days has become yet more uncertain. With unfolding conflict in Iran and the Middle East.
The Chancellor there nodding to the dramatic events going on in Iran and in the Gulf. But did she change enough in the forecast as a result? She was boasting about the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War, but there's still no sign of the really big defence investment plan first promised in the run-up to Christmas, and surely now even more urgent. Meanwhile, the OBR said the government's commitment that defence spending should reach 3.5% of GDP by 2035 could cost around an additional £40 billion in today's money. So that's a massive challenge, and there's not much sense of where the government is going to get that, or indeed over what time frame. So is this really a statement with just one eye open to reality, Sam?
This was a steady as she goes event. So just throwing in that promises that have already been made could cost another £40 billion underscores just how many different potential future paths there are. And frankly, Iran changes everything. It's more than about just defence spending. It changes everything to do with the economy as well. And I really felt that this statement was struggling to keep up. All the economic drama is outside the spring forecast. And to be honest, the main bits of it have been rendered close to nonsense. Right, let me give you some examples. The central claim from Rachel Reeves is the economy is improving because they're doing good work on inflation. But here's some mind-blowing stats for you. The OBR document that was released today priced gas at 89 pence a therm. It's currently £1.48. It's a huge difference. Meanwhile, oil prices are already $16 a barrel higher than those assumed in the OBR. Look, we're in total mega price shock territory. The Resolution Foundation, where I'm sitting, says that if gas prices move in the last few days, if that move is sustained, then there would be and this is an unbelievable figure, there would be a £500 increase in the energy price cap in July. So that's inflation for you, on a scale that families just can't cope with.
To say nothing, Sam, of the huge impact that would have on the national and international picture in terms of what that would mean for funding the war in Ukraine, etc., helping fund the war in Ukraine. Rachel Reeves did spend a lot of time boasting about her record on inflation. Some echoes of Rishi Sunak there for collectors of prime ministers and chancellors who've relied on that as their success metric. Ministers going on television within the hour about the statement to talk up the record on that. Let's spend a moment on what they did say as opposed to perhaps what they didn't. The Treasury promised a steady spring forecast, and they did deliver on that. As for the Office for Budget Responsibility, well, they couldn't put it any more plainly. The central forecasts in this update are similar to those set out in November 2025.
Who better to give a big picture overview than Ruth Curtis, Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation? I caught up with her a few moments ago and just asked whether the whole thing wasn't just out of date.
Sort of as we expected. We saw the OBR make pretty small moves overall, growth down a bit, inflation down a bit, unemployment up a bit. I think that's a bit more than we expected, and we should come back to that. But a surreal day, because really all the moves we've seen in the last few days, all the developments in the Middle East, will probably prove to be more consequential consequential than all the other news the OBR has taken on since November. It feels like that's the speech the Chancellor wanted to deliver today. She wanted to point to lower borrowing, lower inflation in particular, as a government that said it's focused on the cost of living. And that's sort of the speech she gave, but it jarred a bit more given that the biggest kind of impact, most obviously from the Middle East, will be effect on energy prices, effect on inflation, and we know that that will feed through to the cost of living. So in some ways, I don't think we've learned very much today about where we'll be in the autumn because we've got these very small changes and these huge world events, but we have been reminded of how uncertain things can be. So she had good news in lower cost of borrowing from the OBR, but in the last few days, we've seen big moves in gilt yields that would increase the cost of borrowing. That's just a small example of how these things can be swings and roundabouts. And standing back, she's left with very tight public spending settlements for the second half of this parliament, where actually they've been reasonably generous for the first half, and quite a lot of the tax rises that she's already announced actually are still to kick in terms of the impact in people and businesses' pockets.
Well, let's dive into some specifics for now. Sam, what stood out for you?
Well, look, every statement at the moment is got to be judged on what it says about growth, government's top priority, or certainly was once. Growth overall over the 4-year forecast period is actually down, or in the words of Rachel Reeves, largely unchanged. This is an argument with the Treasury over whether or not it's a negative rounding error or just a few tenths of a percentage point. Not a great deal, but politically that will matter. The OBR adjusted its profile of GDP so that there's a little bit less growth in 2026 than there was, a little bit more growth than they had in November in 2027 and 2028. Labour has suddenly fallen in love with the new measure of GDP per head, which takes into account migration. But I think overall the picture on growth is pretty bleak.
But another big indicator that is more positive for the government is the amount of borrowing coming down. In today's forecasts, it's projected to fall at a slightly faster pace of decline than in the November forecast, borrowing revised down there by 8 billion for 2030 to 31 compared to November.
There's another indicator that I think is a warning sign for Rachel Reeves. She said that unemployment is set to peak later than before this year and then fall every year of the forecast period. Now, when a chancellor starts using that kind of jargon, you have to unpick it and you quickly realise that what she actually is saying is that overall unemployment is up. Yes, it's true to say that unemployment will end the parliament lower than it started, but get this, Anne. According to the Resolution Foundation, the peak of unemployment that the OBR is forecasting is actually higher than at the peak of the pandemic, which is quite something. And I think that's an element that the Tories are going to, and Reform UK are going to want to seize on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is quite a peak, as you say. Chancellor's focus is how quickly she can get past that, but that is going to be picked up by her rivals and critics. A curiosity for me is we got through the whole of today with nothing new on policy, but a big new policy speech is coming from the Chancellor. It's just a few weeks away. That's her May's lecture, a successor to the one she did in opposition, where we remember she first set out those fiscal rules that have dominated her chancellorship to date.
That's right. And by kicking the can down the road and not announcing policy for a couple of weeks or more on things like, student loans and the like, she's allowed to perform a trick, the kind of trick that she would decried when she was in opposition. She basically doesn't have to cost it an account for how she's going to pay for any of these policies, because you only really have to do that twice a year, and today is one of those days. So a little bit, whilst they've accounted for things like special educational needs spending, we'll come on to that in a moment, some more big ticket items are consciously not being wrapped into this event, so we don't have to ask this question, how are you going to pay for it? And I think that is not the kind of way of running things that we would have expected from Rachel Reeves if we were to listen to her criticism of, for instance, Liz Truss in opposition.
Yeah, it's quite sneaky sequencing, isn't it? Let's see what she says when she comes forward with her big policy ideas. But if we dig into the OBR report, we're starting to see the consequences of lower migration, one of the government's big targets, on growth. Now, that's not a trade-off Labour is really very keen to highlight when it wants to talk about the benefits of managing down immigration. Average net migration for the next 4 years has gone from 295,000 to 235,000 on the forecasts. It is complicated, of course, because not everyone who comes into the country by any means ends up as a net contributor to the economy, which has been one of the criticisms of having very high immigration levels. But there is certainly a correlation that goes across all developed countries when the number falls suddenly. So jobs go unfulfilled, opportunities can't be taken quickly. And that has an impact on growth.
Yeah, you can see that straight off. The OBR actually upgraded our productivity by 1% in the medium term, but had to offset that by half of that amount because of lower net migration and population aging. So it does have a very real world effect, the OBR thing, though, of course, that's more contested in other parts of the political spectrum. But here's something quite interesting, and here's why we're at the beginning of reassessing quite a lot of things on migration. The OBR have downgraded growth on the basis of the new immigration path, the faster fall in net migration. But they say they don't quite yet, they haven't fully got their head around the new asylum and immigration policies that the government are proposing, and that is therefore not reflected in the forecast due to ongoing consultations. In other words, you could get quite a bigger downgrade in the autumn when we get to the budget by the OBR to account for lower migration, as well as if there's any fast additional fall as a result of the policy changes made by this government and the last one.
But what about impact, Sam, on public spending and on areas the government is keen to show it can be active on, and where it has quite a lot of pressure now coming from the backbenchers and coming from the political realities, often the cold bath of that around Keir Starmer?
Yeah, there's so many different things tugging him to the left, but also there are just so many public spending pressures that have got to be dealt with now. And one of the things we've talked about a lot on this podcast is the special educational needs reforms that Bridget Phillipson set out. Now, I have to say, the OBR document was pretty interesting and in some senses pretty damning for those who thought that the sort of solution had all been tied up in a bow. It says that the government will increase departmental spending on SEND by £4 billion a year from 2028 onwards. But then it basically said, we have no idea what the government's really going to do in practice. Let me quote the OBR. This materially addresses the risk from this pressure, which was unfunded in November, but the impact of the government's recently announced reform plan on the underlying cost pressures in this area remain uncertain. And here's the killer bit. However, the government has not set out specifically how the reforms will deliver this or provided any estimate of any related cost savings, which goes to the key point that we were making last week, which is we've got some of the cuddlier elements of the SEND reform plan, but we haven't actually got the changes that will be voted on in Parliament, the thing that could trigger the rebellion. So for all of those who said Bridget Phillipson did an excellent job, and she did actually roll it out quite cleverly, in part that's because we didn't hear the sort of difficult bit.
And that red light on the SEND reforms is one reason why, despite the massive pressure on this topic, a lot of ministers I've spoken to are actually doubtful about when the big reform can get across the line. Can it be delivered? So we should look towards that and see whether there's a reality check coming there. And we might also cast a glance on the cost pressures in the NHS, strikes and also asylum costs, because the other significant risk within the spending review period includes the potential for further costs arising if industrial action continues in the health service, and whether really the planned reductions in asylum accommodation costs, which the Home Office has been saying it is pursuing zealously, do these really hit the mark? They're very hard to deliver absolutely or at the right time in order to hit these spending targets.
Yeah, the more and more you dig into this spring forecast, far from being a steady as she goes statement, you just get a sense of the uncertainty. I've lost count of the number of times I've heard the Prime Minister boast about the number of times that interest rates have come down. But because of the stuff in Iran that we were talking about earlier, all of that is now completely up in the air. If you look at it, it says market expectations for gas prices have fallen by 15% on average over the forecast period since November, right? That's what the OBR said. Obviously, that's all out the window now. Then look at what it said about interest rates. The OBR says that market participants expect bank rates to fall from 3.75% to 3.3% by late 2026. But if you look at the strategist Quiller, they now say bond yields have risen sharply. Expectations for rate cuts have tapered from 2 to 1 this year. Pretty much now expecting one interest rate cut. So even in the hours after the OBR document was printed, before it was delivered, so many of the seminal boasts of this government have sort of evaporated because of the changing global conditions.
That said, Sam, if you're the government and this is happening, so to speak, over your head to a large extent, it was Donald Trump's decision and not Keir Starmer's and Donald Trump and his Israeli allies who launched the attacks on Iran, and Britain is caught up in the aftermath. You can make the case, which is sometimes quite useful to governments under pressure, that bigger stuff is happening. The timing couldn't have been foreseen, and that they've therefore had to adjust some of their expectations as a result. So that can sometimes be, it's clearly a mixed blessing for the public finances for all the reasons that we've just described. But I wonder if politically there's a bit more wriggle room there than if you're just left, as it were, with your domestic situation and your targets and your plans, and you have to sort of plough on with them. The government is definitely at the moment looking like it is getting a lot of pressure to switch left. So that's another area perhaps which is a bit offset by this. Can it really make the case that we can't do all of these other things that we would love to do that align with our Labour values while we've got planes in the air in defence of conflict in the Middle East?
And actually, Rachel Reeves addressed that directly in her speech, making a plea to save her and Keir Starmer's skins. Listen to this.
But let this House be in no doubt. Every pound that we have invested, every pound in the pockets of working people, every pound that we have secured in this forecast today can be wiped out by a change of course.
Yeah, she goes on to say that political instability would put all the risk that the progress that they have made in jeopardy. So a clear plea to MPs not to force her to spend more money there. Whether it will work, well, we will see in the coming months. But Anne, what did you make of the overall balance of the politics of this? Who were the opposition in this speech?
That's always a good question right now, isn't it? I think we were all keeping a score sheet on that. Multiple attacks on reform. That was certainly my impression as the tattered heirs of failed Tory governments trying to get under the skin of Nigel Farage on that sensitive point for reform, perhaps. Comparatively few brickbats aimed at the Greens after last week's Gorton and Denton shocker for Labour. I think on our account we got 2 mentions of the Greens substantively, and on a day when, as we reported this morning on the podcast, when you were discussing the YouGov poll, they overtook Labour on some reckonings, and about 5 attacks on reform. So would be pretty clear who they think the opposition is, do you reckon?
I think so. I think as a holding statement, though, it has probably done its job. I think the overall global economic context, though, just goes to underscore we do not know what is going to happen next. Globally, economically, domestically, economically, and certainly domestically, politically. Has today's statement made things worse? Probably not. But we have a bit more detail about the scale of the challenges the next time Rachel Reeves does have to open up her checkbook, which will be in the autumn.
Could well be a footnote in Chancellor history by then, Sam.
That's right. We will be back tomorrow morning for Politics at Sam and Anne's as usual, if we're ever normal and usual. So I'll see you then.